I want to say that my background is technically as an anthropologist. I have a lot of interest in the Middle Ages, but this isn't my profession. So focus more on the build ideas and not necessarily the fine details of everything that I'm saying. One last thing I want to say before we get into it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the early, middle, and late Middle Ages. Some people also call this the early, high, and late Middle Ages. And these time periods are going to differ from country to country, but they essentially outline periods from about 500 CE to 1000, 1000 CE to 1200, and 1200 to about 1500 CE. So without further ado, let's get into it. First things first, let's talk technology. Now, I'm not going to give you a list of all the technologies that were and weren't there in the Middle Ages. What I'm more interested in is the way that technology shapes society and culture. For instance, if you want to make a build where all the buildings have glass, you're probably going to want somebody who makes glass as a profession, so you're going to want a glass blower or a glazier. You might also want to show how glass is tied to status. So really big buildings might use a lot of glass, whereas poorer buildings might only use a couple of panes here and there. Another thing that you can do with status is show how it's unevenly distributed. So in the town here, there are a lot of buildings with glass, but out there's only one or two. Coming back here, you can also tie it to materials. If you want to have a glass blower, you're going to need someplace where they're probably mining sand and where they're making charcoal. You can also talk about culture and history. So if people have glass, they're probably going to start making things with that glass. They might make vases and jars and stuff. And those are kind of hard to represent in Minecraft. But one thing you can do is show colored glass. And this is just one way that culture can be shown through technology. You can also talk about history. If there's glass here, it's probably because it hasn't always been here. So maybe older buildings don't necessarily have glass, and only some of the newer buildings do. Now, at the confluence of some of these topics, you might run into things like guilds. A medieval guild is kind of like a union. It's just a group of people who all have a shared interest in something specific. And usually this is in a professional capacity, although it doesn't always have to be. Some guilds were things like town watches, so the town's watch might just be a group of people who are all part of a guild. But a lot of guilds were merchant guilds. Say you had a town where you had a bunch of buildings and they all use glass. Well, maybe there are a couple of glass blowers, and those guys are kind of in competition with each other, and they don't necessarily want to be. What they want is for anyone in the town to be able to get good, high-quality glass at a consistent price. They don't want to be undercutting each other, they just want to be able to sell their goods. So then they start a guild. Most of these guilds would have met in places like town halls or in churches. But if they got really rich, they might purchase their own guild house, which would be a building or a part of a building that they would have all to themselves to talk about business. The last one of these things are building codes and laws. Now, some of these codes and laws might be enforced by the guild themselves, although they might also be enforced legally by the lord of the place. Say people have been having complaints about the quality of glass, or the way that it's being installed. Maybe a glass pane fell and crushed somebody. Well, the Lord might put in rules about how glass has to be installed and what it has to be made out of to count as real glass. Glass is only one example of a technology though, and even then, glass is pretty late medieval. In the early medieval period, you wouldn't have a lot of glass at all. Something that came up often in the Middle Ages was siege warfare. So a siege is basically when you go to a fortified place, i.e. a place that has walls, and you try to break down those walls or get over them or get around. To do this, people came up with these really complex things like trebuchets. Now, what does a trebuchet as a technology show you about a place? Well, it can show you the history. So it can show you that there's a history of fighting in that place. And it can also show you the culture. So it can show you that there's a culture of people building big walls to keep out invaders. This is something that got really popular during the Middle Ages. I'm up here now in the Lord's bedroom because I want to talk about the second thing, which are textiles. Textiles were super popular and super common in the Middle Ages. They were a very prevalent form of art. You have to remember, most people wouldn't have access to things like canvases and paintbrushes. What they had access to was wool and linen. So textiles got super popular as a way of expressing yourself, as a way of socializing. You have to remember, textiles are mostly being done by women at this time. So textiles are a way to earn extra income, to fix up some loose bits of clothing around your house, or even to provide things like insulation. You can see that this is in a castle, right? And a castle has stone walls. If you've ever been in a stone building, you know that that's not going to be very warm. So around the bed, we have all these draping textiles. We also have a tapestry over here, and we have a carpet. These are all pretty common textiles. A tapestry typically shows some kind of artistic scene, so imagine like a big carpet that you hang on the wall. We're in a little guardhouse now because I want to talk about a third thing, which is lighting and heating. Now you can see that there are two ways of lighting and heating this place, as demonstrated by these candles and this fireplace. But in actuality, neither of these things would have been super common during the Middle Ages, and I'll explain why. For one, unless you're building a fire into a wall, you don't necessarily need a fireplace. You can just put it in the middle of a room far away from the other furniture. This is what people did for most of the Middle Ages. In fact, until the late Middle Ages or the early modern period, most people didn't have fireplaces at all. The real impetus for having a fireplace was actually two-story buildings. When you have two stories, you can't just let the smoke out pretty easily. It's going to be a bit more of a pain, and that's when people started getting into it. So if you're doing a medieval build, you might not want to put a ton of chimneys in your town. You might want to do more fire pits. Now, some houses would have had a hole in the roof to let out the smoke, but in some earlier houses, they might have just let the smoke out through a door. Candles are another thing that people associate a lot with the Middle Ages. But candles are another technology, and as we've talked about, technology comes with things like status and money and materials. You have to have somebody who knows how to make candles. You have to have beeswax or tallow. You have to have pieces of string. So candles wouldn't have been super common until about the middle and late Middle Ages. Those iron lamps that are in Minecraft look pretty good, but they're also not very medieval. They did technically exist, but they're going to be a pretty rare thing, and you might want to only put them around very important buildings. Apart from fire pits, there were two pretty common ways of lighting a place. Well, three. So one of them is just letting in light naturally. This is a grate just to represent that there's something blocking the draft here, but that it's not a full glass pane. We also have shutters on the inside because even though medieval people did have shutters, it was rare to see them on the outsides of buildings. In terms of lighting technologies, the two most common ones were a little piece of burning wood or a little lamp. Now, lamps in this age are kind of like the Aladdin lamp in that it's going to be based on oil. So in the Middle Ages, the most common types of these lamps would just be a little bowl filled with some kind of beeswax, oil, or tallow, and a piece of string in it that would slowly burn. It wouldn't be very bright, but it would last for a long time, and that's really what you need. On the other hand, you could take a little piece of burning wood from your fire and carry it around with you, or you could get a special little piece of wood called fat wood, and fat wood is essentially wood that you chop from the middle of a tree where all that sap is. So fat wood burns pretty bright and strong, but very quickly. In terms of fuel, the most common ones are going to be wood, charcoal, and peat. Peat is essentially degraded biomass that piles up at the bottoms of lakes, and then the lakes dry up and you can harvest the peat. You just need to dry it out in the sun a bit, and then it's these big, dark bricks that you can throw into a fire. Charcoal in the Middle Ages is going to be made primarily by creating these kind of earthen mounds and putting a bunch of wood in there, setting it on fire, and then the smoke will kind of cook it into charcoal. There was coal at the time, but it wouldn't have been super common or popular. And things like beeswax would have been reserved mostly for rich or middle class people. If you're poor and you're making any kind of lamp or candle, it's going to be out of tallow or lard. We're back in town now, because the third thing I want to talk about is history. Now, history in the Middle Ages is going to be mostly influenced by three things: the Roman Empire, the Iron Age, and paganism. The Romans, when they went throughout medieval Europe, left a lot of ruins, and even into the high Middle Ages, a lot of people were still either inhabiting these ruins or taking stones from them to build their own stuff out of. So you can consider throwing around a couple of Roman ruins. You're also going to probably want some important Roman institutions. The most important one is Christianity. Of course, Christianity comes to the Middle Ages mostly via the Roman Empire, but Christianity isn't the only big faith around in the Middle Ages. Paganism is still super popular, and there are a lot of pagan rituals that remain common throughout the Middle Ages, like celebrating certain festivals, or even keeping things like shrines and maypoles. The Iron Age is a period that came before the Middle Ages for most of Europe. Most of Europe didn't have that much direct contact with the Romans. They were doing their own thing, and that was the Iron Age. In terms of architecture, the Iron Age is dominated by a lot of circular buildings. So if you look at something medieval and you see that there are a lot of things like concentric rings or a concentric mound, that's probably built on an earlier Iron Age settlement. Iron Age people also built a lot of circular buildings. So in the early Middle Ages, a lot of buildings would have been kind of ovally or circular shaped. They would have been pretty low to the floor, relying mostly on roofing materials instead of materials that make up the walls. And they probably wouldn't have had any windows. They would have just had a door and maybe a hole in the ceiling to let out smoke, maybe not. We're flying up now because I want to talk a bit about hierarchy. Now, in the Middle Ages, there are three kind of tiers of hierarchy. At the top of this is going to be the nobility. Now, nobles in the Middle Ages gain power through a couple of different ways. One is by controlling the food. So nobles have access to most of the land, and if you're farming on the land, you're probably farming a noble's land for him. If you have animals, you're probably grazing a noble's animals for him. The other way is through military power. If you want a technical term for this, the French philosopher Michel Foucault called this necropower. So necropower is the ability to decide who lives and who dies. As a medieval lord, you have the power to kill your enemies, and you have the power to hang criminals. That is necropower, and that is where a lot of your power comes from. Now, the church is also going to benefit a little bit from this necropower, because the church is going to align itself a lot with the king. If you've heard the term divine right to rule, it's the idea that kings are somehow chosen by God to be the rulers of a place. The church is also going to have power because almost everyone in the church has the ability to read and write, which is going to be pretty rare in the Middle Ages. So a lot of people are going to rely on church officials for important documents. And the third level of this kind of hierarchy is going to be the burghers versus the peasants. Now, the peasants are the people who are working down there. They're the ones farming the fields. The burghers, on the other hand, are going to live in the towns. They're mostly craftsmen, merchants, that kind of thing. Burghers are going to have a lot more liquid money, say. They're going to have a lot more cash coming around, whereas the peasants are mostly going to deal in things like grain and livestock. If a peasant has to pay his taxes to his lord, he's going to pay it in grain. Pay his taxes to the church, which is called a tithe, that's probably also going to be in something like grain or maybe ale. Burghers, on the other hand, are going to be paying their taxes with money primarily. While we're up here, I want to make a few notes on the land. The first of these is layout. Now, a lot of people have the idea that settlements before the modern age would mostly just kind of spring up out of nowhere, and that isn't necessarily true. If you look back at the original layouts of a lot of medieval settlements, they were pretty specifically planned out. People had an idea of what was necessary, and they would go where those things were, and they would also bring them with them. So the most obvious things are water and land. You need fresh water in order to drink, cook, clean your clothes, all that stuff. But you also need land for farming and for grazing your animals. A lot of people think of a medieval town as having a certain list of buildings that you check off, like a church, a blacksmith, a tavern, an inn, but as we're going to kind of explain going through it, most of those aren't actually necessary. What you really need in a medieval town is some kind of representation of the hierarchy, land to be farmed, and fresh water. Other important things are things like defenses, some kind of central gathering place for the town, and some place for people to wash their clothes. In terms of land, we can also talk about land management practices. Now, I mentioned in the Iron Age that people were doing a lot with earthworks, and that is true, but they were doing a ton of other things as well. People have the image of England as a place where there's all these rolling hills, but those places all used to be forest. It's just that in the Bronze and Iron Ages, they were cut down. So of course you can clear out forest and make areas like this that look like they used to be forest and they were cleared out, and that is one way to represent land management. Another one, like I said, are mounds and earthworks. So this is an earthenwork barrier over here, separating these two lands. Another really common one is going to be ditches and dams. So a lot of people, if they want to make a supply of fresh water, they're just going to kind of dam up a pond to make sure that it doesn't drain. And people will even divert rivers. And the last one I want to talk about are forests and trees. So we have the idea that forests are places that are untouched, that you can somehow find a forest that hasn't been interacted with by humans. But that isn't really true, and it wasn't true during the Middle Ages. People were managing and going into forests quite a lot, both to hunt, to collect firewood, to lay traps, to forage, to get mushrooms and berries, and all kinds of stuff. So people would have shaped the forest by the things that they did in it. Another thing is that people would have shaped the trees around them. And there are two words for this kind of practice. One is pollarding, and the other one is coppicing. I've included a bunch of these trees here, but the point is to get a bunch of little thin sticks that you can then use for everyday stuff. They're going to be really useful for making wicker fences, or you can just talk about Minecraft fences. But these thin sticks that grow out of pollarded or coppice trees are also going to be really useful for firewood. There's only so many times you can go into a forest and pick up all the sticks on the ground, so if you're going to make a big settlement like this, think about giving them some kind of renewable source of firewood. I'm here at this tavern at the beginning of town to talk a little bit about shopping and services. Now, the main one, and one that people don't really think about, is the fact that shops are rare. In order to have a shop, you need a constant stream of clientele. In most towns, this is just not doable. Most people are either going to sell out of a tiny little front part of their house with no real sign, you just know where to go, or they're going to set up at a weekly market. So markets were really common during the Middle Ages. You would have some kind of town green space set up. There's one over there where people could come and set up all their little market stalls. And once a year or once every couple years, you would have a huge fair. And a fair is like a market times 100. Fairs would have tons of market stalls, but they would also have attractions for people to come to. And they would have their own kind of legal system because people would come from far away to participate in a fair, which meant that you would have all these foreign people coming in and you needed rules and you needed some way to enforce those rules. Now, people in the Middle Ages did have their own legal systems, but these could be a bit slow at times, and that's why the fairs needed their own system. But the reason that I'm at a tavern is because taverns and inns are also really rare. Now, people who play Dungeons and Dragons or watch a lot of fantasy movies may have the idea that every town needs a tavern or every town needs an inn. But taverns are kind of rare, and inns are very hard to find in the Middle Ages. And this is for a few reasons. Like I said, it takes a lot of time and upkeep and money to devote an entire building just to one service. You need a constant stream of customers, and you just can't get that in most places. On the contrary, most people are going to drink at public houses. Now, a public house is just someone's house where they've opened up the ground floor because they were brewing a bunch of beer in the backyard or a bunch of ale, and they want you to come drink with them and spend a bit of your money there. These places would be open sporadically, and you would just know, oh, John's house is a public house now, so we're going to go drink at John's. It was a much more informal, but more communal, arguably, system than going to a tavern. Likewise, inns would only really be found in medium to large sized towns or cities. If you were just going into a small village, or even just a small town, you probably wouldn't need to sleep anywhere specific. You might be traveling with some kind of tent or carriage, and you could just sleep under the carriage or sleep in your tent. A lot of people would have slept under hedges, which is just like a big bush. Hedges were super common in the Middle Ages. And the most common of all, arguably, is just staying with someone. If you keep going to the same town over and over again, you just know people. And especially if you just go to someone's house and you say, hey, can I stay with your family for the night and I'll give you a little bit of the stuff that I'm selling in town, they would almost always let you stay. The last service I want to talk about are baths and laundry. So a lot of towns would have had places where people could all do their laundry together and get baths. And baths and laundry places are going to employ a lot of women. Now, while I'm in town, I want to point out something about these signs, and that is language. Now, for one, most people weren't literate in the Middle Ages. Even lords often wouldn't be literate. It's not just a class thing, it's that literacy was seen as a profession-specific thing. If you were a scribe, you'd be literate. If you were anyone else, you probably just wouldn't be. It's the same way that today most people don't know how to wire their own electricity. Even though they technically probably could buy the tools, most people just don't do it because that's just an electrician's job. So that's why in town, I've used all these little custom-made signs instead of writing what each shop is. That way people can get around without having to read. And this would be very common in the Middle Ages. If you've ever wondered why most pubs in England are called something like the Three Heads, or the King's Head, or the King's Arms or something, it's because they would have a big painted sign out front and it would look like the thing that it's called. Another note on language is that most people wouldn't speak the language that was being written in, because most writing was happening in Latin, whereas most people spoke what would be called vulgar languages, which is like English, French, Spanish, whatever. But it's just your day-to-day stuff. That's not what people were writing in. And lastly, a scribe is somebody whose job it is to read and write, basically. They would often serve a lord or a king or something, but they could also just work in town. They might work with a bailiff, which is the person who is running a town, kind of day-to-day administration stuff. Or they might offer their services to other people. So say you really wanted to have something written down for legal sake, you might ask a scribe to write it down for you. So this is the second to last thing I want to talk about, and that is labor and self-sufficiency. Now, almost everyone in the Middle Ages would have had a garden like this. You would have some kind of storage, maybe you'd have like some pots or barrels. You'd probably have a little garden where you were growing vegetables, a couple of animals, most likely a place to do your own laundry if you had access to fresh water, which these people don't really because it's on a hill. You might be keeping some birds or hunting dogs, and a lot of people would have these kind of porches or balconies that would let them get down to the garden level from the top. This is, of course, if we're talking about kind of middle to late Middle Ages, where people in towns are starting to build two-story buildings instead of just one-story. Now, a really important thing that people have to think about with the Middle Ages is that there's no big distinction between free time and labor. You might have heard a statistic thrown around that people in the Middle Ages had more free time than you. That isn't true. They had no free time because they didn't have the idea of free time. People in the Middle Ages were constantly doing labor. I mentioned those textiles earlier. Well, after a hard day working, you wouldn't necessarily go home and read because you couldn't read. You would sit down and make textiles, or you might sit down and cook. You might feed the animals, or you might start working on a bit of your house. You might do some gardening in the back, or you might make some simple earthenware pots to store some stuff in. The point is, there were very few activities that would have been classified purely as leisure. Even if you think of something like hunting or fishing, which today are almost purely leisure activities, they would have served a specific function, and those things were labor. The only real free time you would have is when you went to church, which you would have to do, otherwise people in the town would shun you. The last thing I want to talk about is color. Now, a lot of people don't really think about it, but the Middle Ages was a super colorful place. People were very, very into colors. Now, there are some restrictions on this. A sumptuary law is a law that dictates how you're allowed to spend your money, and it typically relates to things like big displays of wealth, like colorful clothing, or expensive funerals. And the Middle Ages was full of sumptuary laws, so not everyone was allowed to wear everything. You also had laws on what kind of colors you were allowed to show in warfare. So if a lord or a king had a color, only he was able to show it. You can't just start showing the king's colors just because you're on his side. That would be a huge no-no, and it would get you into a lot of legal trouble. Still though, the Middle Ages was overwhelmingly bright. I've designed this room based off of a couple of paintings, and I really wanted to go for a nice yellow and red and blue primary color trifecta because I really wanted it to be bright, but also bright in a way that is consistent and not way too flashy, you know? But the Middle Ages would have been full of all these wall paintings, frescoes. These walls are basically painted all the way up to here, and then that's a baseboard level. This is a white painting level, and then this is another level of colorful paintings. Those stairs represent where the walls have been painted, or the wooden boards supporting the ceiling. The people were so into color that it would really shock our modern sensibilities. But if I take us back out into the town, then we can see houses like this, which are brightly painted. Now this is what we call wattle and daub. Wattle and daub is kind of a mixture of wicker and wooden fence posts that are packed together with a kind of wet mud walling that you then have to paint over with whitewash. That's why the typical medieval building is white, because it's full of whitewash. But people in towns, when they had a bit more money, a bit more access to dyes and paints and stuff, loved painting their houses. So this is a yellow house, that's a green one. There's one up here that's pink, purple, and even blue. Now, a note on colorful places is that, again, if we go back to that discussion of technology, you need somebody who's making this colorful stuff, and you need to have an idea of where those materials come from. There were a couple of really common dyes in the Middle Ages, like madder, woad, but you can use almost anything to dye stuff. Dandelions were used as dye, lapis lazuli and indigo were very common dyes, but they were reserved more for rich people, and even blackberries were used very commonly to dye stuff, as were beets. Over here we have a berry field, and you can just imagine the kind of stains you would get on your clothing from picking berries all day. But if you want to have dyes in colorful places, you're probably going to have some of these things in your world, like berry fields, or a place where they're mining lapis, or even a dye works where they're mixing all these kind of dyes together with linens to make them really colorful. That is going to do it for today, guys, though. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, let me know how your own builds are going. I always love to hear that kind of stuff. Tell me if I missed anything that you would have liked to have seen covered in this video, and I will see you guys next time.